Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, with the impending election in less than 2 weeks in Canada, we take a look at each of the three main parties going into that election and analyse how well or otherwise they would represent the Sikh community should they get into power. And talking about representation, how so many different interests all claim to know who Sikhs are and what they represent, whether it's Hindutva, the Indian government, or just online observers with an agenda. We take a look at the ongoing battle to define what Sikhs do genuinely represent. And of course, the information war has played a massive part in that, and we all know what role the government of India has played in that. Well, a recent article highlights just how bad things have become in ensuring the actual truth rarely enters the mainstream narrative. And finally, we have a fantastic display of Gatka at Vaisakhi, demonstrated by, would you believe it, a British policeman, a Sikh of course. All this and more on today's show. But joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our amazing viewers out there. Thanks for being a part of the show. Don't forget, we always love your comments and we look forward to them. And we're also trying to build the channel even further, so please feel free to invite your family, friends, and colleagues to join us and subscribe to the channel. Hey, the subscription doesn't cost anything, but it helps us with the algorithms. And of course, you can always go to the link tree if you do feel the need to support the channel and make a small contribution. It all helps. Thanks for tuning in, and back to you, Angus.
Indeed, all very much appreciated from our audience. And meanwhile, James and I together will be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And yes, indeed, at the end of the show, as always, we'll take a look at a few of your great comments. So do stay tuned for that. Right, James, let's get the show underway. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
As the election race heats up here in Canada, we're only 2 weeks away. It's hard to believe that it comes up so fast, but again, in Canada, we tend to have an entire election cycle from the campaigning through to counting the ballots in the time it takes the U.S. to announce who's running for each party. So we tend to do things a little quicker here in Canada because, hey, we don't have time to waste. Now, let's take a look at what exactly we are facing in terms of the options and the different stands that the parties are campaigning on. And I thought that this was important for our audience to understand. Now, we have several different parties in Canada, but primarily we're going to focus quickly on about 5 or 6 of them, just to give a quick overview. And then we're going to narrow in on the 3 major parties. And those are the ones that we really need to be watching during this election cycle. Now, we know that different things, such as the current geopolitical cycle, the tariffs and trade, as well as political interference, can all play a role in this year's election, given that it was a snap election called with the resignation of Justin Trudeau, as well as the quick appointment of Mr. Mark Carney in his replacement. Canadians are excited to go to the ballots, but at the same time, they are very much concerned about the future of Canada in today's political climate. So without further ado, let's take a look here. Now on the screen, we have images of some of the main players in this year's election. So we have, of course, Mark Carney sitting there with a big grin on his face, because he is ahead in the polls, I would assume. And then you have other party leaders, but we'll just go over the main ones. We have Pierre Poilievre here. We have Mr. Yves, Francois. He is with the Bloc Québécois. Down below, you have Maxime Bernier here on the right, and he is the leader of the People's Party of Canada. You have the Green Party, Elizabeth May, Jagmeet Singh, of course. We all recognize that face, and it's kind of funny because usually he's the one with the biggest smile and welcoming image, but today he's not smiling. I guess he's just thinking about Pierre Poilievre up here on the right, and he's got that grin on his face because he really doesn't have a clue as to what's going on. In my opinion, he doesn't realize there's an election going on. He keeps repeating bumper sticker slogans that just are not winning him credibility. He was very focused on repeating a lot of the platform issues that Donald Trump was running on, and that seems to have bitten him in the ass because he has tanked in the polls as of late. And the more Donald Trump frustrates Canadians, the more they take it out on Pierre Poilievre and his Conservative Party. And so, as we said, there are different issues that are facing Canadians, and there's the economic anxiety, which we've already spoken of, not just in terms of the trade issues and tariffs, but just overall on inflation and the cost of living, the need for more housing and affordable housing at that. So there's a lot of different tension and a lot of issues that we're facing. Now, of course, we need to also be sure that we are facing our identity and our sovereignty, and that is going to be a major issue. I think that because of the international geopolitical situation, we are missing out on a lot of the platform issues when it comes to the other things that are impacting Canada. Now, this could be foreign interference, the transnational repression. It can be, social issues and, from the opioid crisis that is still ravaging lives and people, communities and families throughout the country and around the world. So again, there's so many different issues that we need to deal with, including that of crime, that unfortunately a lot of it is taking a back seat and we're not seeing what the plan is when it comes to those issues. So what are the issues? Well, let's take a look at the parties. Let's break them down a bit, and then we will just go through each party's platform, and then why I think that we need to look at them deeper in terms of selecting who you're going to vote for when it comes specifically to minority rights and respect of different ethnicities, religious backgrounds, personal identities, and so forth. So, of course, we know the Liberal Party is led by Mark Carney, the newly crowned Prime Minister and former Bank of England Governor that Angus loves so much. But he's offering fiscal prudence with progressive flair, and that really depends on which side of the coin you're sitting on. There is some controversy surrounding him and his investment companies, as well as his blind trust in which he has put his holdings in while he is Prime Minister and moving towards this election. Now, his platform includes reducing the federal income tax rate, boosting housing supply with nearly 500,000 new builds per year, and negotiating a new trade deal and security pact with the U.S. Now, when it comes to Carney's Liberals, they're also pledging to enshrine CBC funding into law and invest in clean and low-carbon energy simultaneously. Now, the CBC is much like the UK when it comes to the BBC, or down in the US, they have different state-funded media as well. And it's not controlled. It's not state-controlled media. It just has public funds going into it. And there are a lot of benefits to having the CBC or the BBC, but there's also a lot of drawbacks and cost factors that we'll explore in another show, because this show is focused on the election issues. So let's take a look at Mr. Pierre Poilievre, or Trump 2.0, as I call him. Now, his Conservatives are going full throttle on economic liberalization, cutting the lowest income tax bracket to 12.75%, scrapping carbon tax, and lifting development fees on new housing. There's a lot of different reasons why this is concerning, and most of all because of the breaks that are being levied on those housing initiatives are actually really going to benefit the corporate landowners, the corporate landlords, more than it is the first-time homeowners or families that are struggling right now. So there's a lot of different, and as I said, each party has its positives and its negatives. Now, in terms of their approach, they are looking at defunding the CBC programming entirely, which I think has a major impact on the development of Canadian talent and Canadian programming, not to mention Canadian news and other issues or other programs that the CBC brings to us. The party's also pursuing a Canada First trade and energy strategy, favoring deregulation and accelerated development of natural resources. And again, this is something that we've seen play out south of the border, and I'm not sure that Canadians really want to look at this and trust Pierre Poilievre at this point. But again, that's my opinion on that. Now let's take a look at our friend Jagmeet Singh. He is a leader that really stands out in my mind because they are very far behind in the polls compared to the Conservatives and the Liberals. But I think that they have a prime opportunity, if they play it right, to pick up a lot more seats here in Canada. They have the opportunity to expand the party's presence and their influence. We know that the NDP joined a partnership with the Liberal Party to maintain a control and governing party in the Parliament this past session and this past election cycle, or sorry, this past term. And so they've had a lot of influence when it came to influencing things like dental program, medication prices for the average family and senior citizens, and so many other social initiatives that have really helped to uplift to a level the people at most vulnerable states within Canada. So again, he's had a really progressive plan for that and continues to do that, and was beneficial that when they did join with the Liberals, they had certain parameters, and those seem to be followed through on, which is a big thing in the world of politics. Now, Singh wants to retrofit over 3 million homes and build 100,000 rent-controlled units on federal land and a 10,000 EV rebate, and plans to hire 35,000 nurses to reflect their progressive priorities. And that is something that is desperately needed in Canada. We do have a shortage, and the ratios are, unsustainable in terms of the burnout and the number of nurses leaving the field just because of the patient to nurse ratios. So we need to improve on that. And I think that that's where they really can shine through and bring that, because that's impacting almost every Canadian, either directly or through their families. Now, the Bloc Québécois focused mainly on Quebec's interests, so we don't spend a lot of time on them, and not as a disrespect, but just because it doesn't really impact the nation as a whole. They do have a lot of fight when it comes to Parliament and the House of Commons, but at the end of the day, we don't see them as a potential winner of the race because of the fact that they are primarily within the boundaries of Quebec. Now, Elizabeth May, again, she's got limited seat power, but unlimited ambition. She's very aggressive in terms of her stands and her opinions. She doesn't hold back that way. And again, she is part of the Green Party, so very aggressive climate targets, Indigenous rights, and of course, social justice initiatives. But again, we don't see her as a major player. The People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, we're not even going to waste time or spend time. I shouldn't say waste time, but we're not going to spend time on that because we've got, again, limited time. But let's take a quick look at the minority rights records and who's talked the talk and who's walked the walk. So you have the Liberals, champions of multiculturalism, the LGBTQ plus rights, introducing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to legalize same-sex marriage, and arms sales to the anti-LGBTQ regimes have raised eyebrows. And we don't mean necessarily weapons. We're just talking about their way to whether or not they're going to balance it and move forward, or if they're going to pull back on those rights that they've afforded them. Now, the Conservatives, of course, have appointed visible minority MPs, but face backlash for opposing at citizenship ceremonies, pushing debates on gender identity, raising concerns over religious and trans rights. So again, really polarizing issues across the nation, and I think that that is, again, going to hurt them, especially that they repeated a lot of the rhetoric that we see out of the States, and people are really uncomfortable with that. Now, the NDP, of course, consistently scores highest in supporting marginalized communities, calling for Indigenous language recognition and systemic equity policies. But at the same time, is that going to be enough to push them over the edge? I don't think so. But again, I think they've got a huge opportunity under the leadership of Jagmeet Singh to really capture some seats in key ridings. And I think that's going to play out well for them in this election cycle. The Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, and the PPC. Again, if you want to freeze the frame, you can take a quick summary overview of them. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because our time is limited. So let's finish off with looking at who's been targeted by foreign interference and how that's been handled throughout the parties. Now, the Liberals have been targeted by Chinese-linked disinformation campaigns, especially against Chrystia Freeland when she was assistant to Justin Trudeau, of course. MP Chandra Arya, we've talked about quite a bit and was dropped from the ballot over questionable ties to India, and we've already covered that. So if you're familiar with it, great. If not, by all means, go back into our show archives and check it out. You can find out a lot about his questionable links to India and Narendra Modi and the other Hindu extremist views and missions. The Conservatives, once again, they are really facing a lot of controversy because of the fact that several MPs may have been compromised, though we don't have hard evidence yet. I'm sure that it is in the pipes because there are still investigations going on. And there has been some credible sources and the foreign interference report that pointed fingers at the leadership race for the Conservative Party. So again, that's going to definitely have an impact on their leadership race, their prime ministerial race in this election. The NDP and Greens have avoided direct interference, but are vocal about the need for transparency through tougher legislation. Again, I think that's something that all Canadians must insist on, is that we have transparency and we increase our ability to detect and to deal with foreign interference. And we've seen a huge increase from India, from Russia, from China, from Iran, and other nations around the world. So we need to be very aware of that, but we've also seen some influence and attempted meddling from south of our border as well. Let's just take a quick overview to close out here on the leaders themselves. Mark Carney, of course, a global finance heavyweight, has turned political leader. He's calm, calculated, and climate-focused. Carney brings international gravitas to the Liberal Party, which they've been long lacking in some areas. Pierre Poilievre, of course, populist, pugilist, and he's a polarizing issue with roots in Alberta and a passion for deregulation. Poilievre is rallying fiscal hawks and libertarians alike, but again, has really lost in the polling and his support base. Jagmeet, of course, is Canada's first racialized federal party leader. Singh blends progressive policy with charisma, as well as being a Sikh lawyer and activist. He's a champion of economic and racial justice. And I think that he really, as I said, I can't say enough that I think that he's on a solid ground to pick up some more seats. And what's at stake with global tensions rising and Canadians facing inflation, housing shortages, divisive debates on identity and rights. It's going to be a referendum on policies and values as much as it is going to be on the leadership of our country and the future of Canada. So we'll have to watch and see if Canada leans into fiscal conservatism, or if they're going to double down on progressive reform and or reimagine its place in the world under new leadership and a new trade regime that seems to be working out in the global scale. Whatever the outcome, one thing is certain: the election will shape Canada's social, economic, and geopolitical future for decades to come. So we'll have to watch closely. But again, I encourage you that if you are in Canada and planning to vote, or outside of Canada but still eligible to vote, that you do so, regardless as to which party or which MPs that you vote for. It's important that everybody gets out, has their voice heard, participates in the democratic process, and learns about the candidates through Election Canada and other reputable sources, because we know there's still a lot of foreign interference, a lot of fake information out there, disinformation, misinformation, and so forth. So try to make sure that you do your research. Don't just follow the TikTok posts or the Twitter posts, because they can be very much influenced and misleading. So let's pull together, Canada. Let's show how great we are as a nation to come out of an election with real respect for one another as we go into it and as we move past it, regardless as to the outcome. Angus, that is a bit of a longer report today, but again, I thought it was an essential one to look at as the race heats up, and we're only 2 weeks away from going to the polling stations, Angus.
Yeah, fascinating, James. Thanks for that. That really does give a really good overview of who is who and what is what. And what I find particularly fascinating, we have a phrase, a week is a long time in politics. Well, you only need to look at the polls over just recent months to see how external events can have such a massive impact on a nation's potential election. And of course, we've seen Carney's Liberal Party suddenly swing from being way behind in the polls to suddenly ahead in the polls. And that's an enormous swing, and all it's essentially down to external events. And that external event really is just one man, Donald Trump. And fascinating to see how that has really influenced the electorate in Canada, based on it's very similar to politics the world over, and certainly here in the UK. If there is a leader who's in trouble, they always manage to drum up a war or some external threat, and suddenly people tend to rally round a leader at any given time, no matter how bad that leader is. There's this natural human instinct to rally round your leader if there is a perceived external threat, and that's clearly what's happened in Canada with the Trump situation, and his attacks on Canada has ironically moved massive levels of support towards the Liberal Party, hence why Mark Carney is suddenly now ahead in the polls. Yeah, my attitude towards Mark Carney, I've made no secret about it. I'm certainly no fan of Carney. He was our governor of the Bank of England here, and frankly, according to many people's opinions, made an absolute hash of it. He caused all sorts of problems in the housing market, kept interest rates far too low for far too long, etc., etc. He's not a politician, and he is described as a financial heavyweight. Well, it's questionable. What we do know is he's a globalist. He is heavily associated with the World Economic Forum, and by that makes me extremely suspicious of his agenda. He has no political background, yet suddenly we find this man with no political background suddenly the Prime Minister of Canada, unelected, and also with these strong ties to the World Economic Forum, who also have ties to Macron and all sorts of other leaders around the world. So again, my red flag alarm bells are sort of waving wildly. Who is this man, and what actually genuinely does he represent? If I had to guess what he represented, I would actually say he's more of a conservative, he's more of a free market character, he's more of a globalist character, and therefore that would sit more naturally in the Conservative Party. And so therefore I see him as an opportunist. He saw, or the World Economic Forum saw, an opportunity to replace Trudeau with one of their own man, Carney, who I suspect deep down is really a conservative. They thought, yeah, great position, let's get our own man Carney into that position. He's suddenly now the Prime Minister of Canada. So again, all my suspicions are really alerted with Mark Carney. Unfortunately, but he does represent a party that does actually, in my opinion, represent the Sikh community very well. It has a track record of being extremely supportive for the Sikh community. So there's a real dichotomy there. There's a real problem, a real dilemma almost, a political dilemma there. Do you support the man or do you support the party? I don't know, we shall see. But of course then on the other hand we have the Conservatives. Well, traditionally right-wing capitalists, maybe my own politics are more sympathetic towards the right wing, certainly the Conservatives in terms of free market, freeing up deregulation, that sort of thing. But of course then you move further to the right and then you start to come into the problems of racism, of anti-immigration, all that sort of element as well. Of course Poilievre has been linked with I would say more certainly further right from centre policies, particularly when it comes to links to India and the right wing in India influencing potentially that party, the Conservative Party. So of course then there is this sort of genuine default belief that the Conservatives in Canada probably less represent the Sikh community than the Liberals do. So that of course is something to be careful of. And then we have the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. Well, I think that's a pretty clear-cut case. I think realistically he's not going to be the next Prime Minister, but this is where it does start getting interesting. When polls are relatively tight, it then does come down to what they call the balance of power. And it's smaller parties like the NDP. I don't think the Greens will have enough swing in Canada, but certainly the NDP has in the past and certainly does in this election potentially hold the balance of power. And this is the beauty of this system now then, because Jagmeet Singh's NDP it's very easy for them, knowing in reality they're not going to be the next government, but they can come out with really progressive policies that actually probably wouldn't stand I would say that the lens of reality. If they became government and they instituted some of these policies, they would actually probably very quickly get knocked into the long grass, because actually economically more than anything they are unrealistic. They are ideological but really, in simple terms, they just can't be afforded. But this is where they can have a powerful influence, because NDP's policies, whatever they may be, are progressive, they are ideological, they are good for humanity in reality. But if they then hold the balance of power, so if, for example, the Liberals need the NDP once again to form a government, it means the NDP can say, look, we have these policies, okay, they don't necessarily need to be mainstream, but we want to influence your policies so they move more towards our policies. And that, in that way, it's these more extreme ideological policies, the good policies, let's say, that are harder to finance. They can then have a more positive influence on the actual policies that then do come into power. So it is these smaller parties like the NDP that I think could really have a big impact in this coming election, particularly if these polls are as close as I think they will be, and the actual result could be as close. I don't know if it's going to be a clear cut outcome, but we will see. Of course, India does have a huge stake in this election. They've no doubt been trying beneath the surface very hard to influence this election as much as they can, particularly probably towards the Conservative Party. They will be watching this outcome very closely because, of course, the large Sikh population in Canada has a very large, I would say very large, that's an understatement, I would say a huge pro-Khalistan movement in Canada. And, of course, we've seen India's terrified fear of the Sikh population in Canada, which has manifested itself in the murder even of a very high-profile campaigner in the form of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So I think India will be watching this very closely. Really, fingers are crossed. I mean, well, who do we really want to win, James? I don't know, but well, obviously Jagmeet Singh will represent the community best of all, but ultimately it's likely that the Liberal Party will be the closest to what will benefit the Sikh community. But then again, it comes down to that sort of dilemma. Is it the party or the man that's going to really push the agenda? Is it going to be Carney, or is it going to be the Liberal Party as a whole? We'll see. But certainly, as in most elections, it's a fascinating one, James.
Absolutely. And if you're out there and want to hear more from Jagmeet, by all means, email him, because we've been trying to get him on the show for a while and we just keep getting brushed aside. So again, email them, tell them they've got to come on Perspectives, Satellite TV, tell them, whether it's Jagmeet or one of his representatives, we'd love to have them on the show, but tell them that you want them. And if you don't have one of these, which is your voter card, don't worry. Just make sure that you go to the polls with your identification and proof of residency so that you can show that you live in that area where you need to cast your vote for. And let's make this election count, folks.
Absolutely, indeed. Right, James, let's move on and onto my first story. And how often are we struggling to explain on behalf of the Sikh community? It's very presumptuous, but even we have the ability to explain what the Sikh community represents as a generalisation. We do know from our own research and our own interactions with the community what the community represents, a lot of its history, etc. But there are so many interests out there that do their absolute best to claim that they speak for the community and that they can, in their own way, define the community and what it stands for. Well, this, of course, has created a massive battle because, of course, there's only one community that can define the Sikh community, and that is the Sikh community itself. And, of course, this is why the community does have this perennial battle trying to stand up against particularly nefarious interests in the form of Hindutva and the Indian government, and who themselves obviously have their own agenda in trying to explain and define what the community stands for their own agenda. Well, Baz wrote a very interesting article when we were away last week, James, and I want to bring up this article. It's a fascinating article, and it really does sum up, I think, the issue and this forever battle that the Sikh community is having in trying to say, look, this is who we are, and that is not what we are, what these other people claim we are. And Baz has written this on behalf of the Sikh Coalition, actually. They've tried to make it clearer and explain this ongoing battle. And as they say, who does actually speak for and define our community? Well, it was actually two recent events, and amongst many actually events that have particularly highlighted this issue. We reported on one of them. It was the Hindu American Foundation in California who stood before an education board and said, look, Punjabi Americans must be defined as Indian Americans, and likewise Bengali Americans must be defined as Indian Americans, because again it's all part of this agenda where they don't want to see India as a collection of component parts of different cultures. They just want to try and define this homogenous Indian. There is only one Indian. There isn't a Bengali, there isn't a Punjabi or a Tamil or whatever. We are all Indians, and this agenda they're pushing really hard to try and give this united idea of India, which really goes against the grain, and which is why I think we commonly say that we believe that India will ultimately break up because they're fighting against reality. And of course, this one particular event that happened in California, the HAF, the Hindu American Foundation, they tried to assert that the state's ethnic studies model curriculum was actually wrong by suggesting that Sikh American was a distinct identity. In other words, they pushed hard that they should be seen as Indians, not Sikh Americans. And of course, when this representative of the HAF was challenged, they said, look, they actually fell back on their default argument where they conflated the Sikh community with terrorism and extremism, which is why they're saying, look, we're trying to do the Sikh community a favour, which again was met with complete outrage right across the community. Now, the Sikh coalition itself, they've fought this massive battle on behalf of the community for quite a long time now with all these sorts of organisations, whether it's the Hindu American Foundation, but they're trying to get the correct, true narrative into the mainstream. And one of the other situations that also happened recently, they've been battling with the Civics Alliance. The Civics Alliance is an organisation which they themselves have created this model for social studies that they're pushing into schools, where they're trying to, again, try and push some sort of propaganda piece, where, they're trying to explain to young children, educate young children about what all these communities are, who they are and what they represent. And of course, Sikhi is mentioned in their model. And once it's mentioned once regarding its founding as a world faith, but it's also once again represented by what they claim is terrorism. They call it once again Sikh terror, and of course the problem with this is, of course, it's the children that are being educated, ultimately indoctrinated into whatever they are being taught, and that forms their worldview going forward. And unfortunately, the Civics Alliance in the US has actually a huge amount of influence, and this is why the Sikh Coalition, amongst many organisations, are trying to have this dialogue with this organisation. Say, look, no, you cannot do this. And this focus on Sikh terror that they're pushing lacks, of course, any context regarding what's happened in the past and the Indian government's treatment of the community, particularly during the 1980s and the 90s. And also, it really is undermining 2 decades worth of work that the organisations for the community have been working hard on to try and distance themselves from this typical social stereotype and prejudice that came particularly from 9/11. Post 9/11, of course, the first person to be murdered in a racist incident after 9/11 was a Sikh, which was outrageous, of course, because of course people can't tell the difference. People who don't know better can't tell the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim. And of course, this poor gentleman, a Sikh, was an innocent Sikh, was murdered in retaliation for 9/11. So again, there is this constant battle to try and educate people about just who the Sikh community are and what they represent. Now, the Civics Alliance, as I said earlier, look, they insist, they quote that they're doing the Sikh community a favour. They argue that there is no greater champion for the community than themselves, and that the focus on Sikh terror is in fact a uniquely wonderful representation for Sikhs in American schools. I mean, it's absolute nonsense, of course it isn't, but of course the Civics Alliance have clearly got their own agenda. But again, when they claim to speak for the Sikh community and define the Sikh community, it's absolutely miles away from the truth. Now, of a particular note, the issue of Sikh community's connection to extremism in India was actually litigated by more than 56 scholars just 5 years ago. Because there was a publication produced by the MacDonald Laurier Institute, entitled Khalistan, a Project of Pakistan. Now, how often have we been down this road where we are trying to explain to many of our critics who say, oh, the pro-Khalistan, the Khalistan movement, it's all just a secret project of ISI, the intelligence services of Pakistan. No, it's not. And the community has had to fight for so many years to try and remove this nonsense narrative, usually perpetuated by Hindutva, that the Khalistan movement is really just a project of, as per this thing, a project of ISI, of the Pakistan intelligence service. They're just trying to, Pakistan is trying to cause mischief against its traditional enemy, India. And of course, the Khalistan movement is nothing to do with Pakistan. It might have had support in the past by Pakistan, but that does not mean or imply or define the fact that it is anything to do with Pakistan. It just happens to align with Pakistan's interests. So there's a huge difference there. And of course, it was litigated against by those Sikh scholars a few years ago. This article says, look, why are Sikhs having to argue with anyone else, whether it's white academics or Hindu American activists, about how to define our community, our history and ourselves? It does seem absolutely outrageous that the community is having to fight this very battle. And starting back in 2008, the Sikh coalition even worked in Texas to correct more than 50 errors in major school textbooks. Amongst many debunked claims were that Sikhi is based on the Hindu devotion to Vishnu. And again, this brings into this, again, another age-old nonsense comment that we see regularly, even in our own comments, that Sikhs are just simply another extension of Hindus. And of course, no, Sikhi is a completely independent religion from Hindu. It is not Hinduism in any other form. It is Sikhi. It is a separate independent religion. And that is, again, a narrative that is being stained and smeared and diluted regularly by Hindutva activists on a regular basis. And the Sikh coalition joined with interfaith allies to fight back against attempts by some groups to replace references to Sikhs with Indian culture, eliminate fact-based information about caste, etc. So again, it's all about this Hindutva battle. The Hindutva are trying very hard, of course, to say, look, there are no Sikhs, there are no Punjabis, you're all Indians, you're all, by extension, Hindus. Again, just trying to destroy and bury this individual identity of Punjab Sikhs, which of course is ultimately the root of Khalistan, the pro-Khalistan movement. But the problem, of course, then comes back to 1947 to 1950, when the Indian constitution itself was drafted, where indeed their own constitution fails to recognise Sikhi as an independent world religion. It was under Article 25B. It was very mischievously put under the definition of Hindus. So again, even under the Indian constitution, deliberately so, the Brahmins ensured that Sikhi, amongst many other relatively minor religions in India, were defined under the umbrella of Hinduism, which in itself was a complete nonsense. Now, every community indeed has the right to define itself. It's fundamental, it's obvious, and the Sikh community has categorically rejected definitions of Sikhi put forth by non-Sikhs. Of course they have. Nobody can define Sikhs other than Sikhs themselves. And students, as they say, as they conclude this article, students should see Sikhi reflected in constitutionally and age-appropriate ways throughout school curricula. Of course, children should be taught the truth. Including Sikhi at all levels of education will ultimately allow students to both understand the traditions in the context of other global religions and explore that context around Sikh American immigration to the United States. And of course, bring that into the context of why so many are in the US, because of course that relates back to the Sikh genocide. And likewise here in the UK, Europe, down Australia and New Zealand, the diaspora was built massively, was bolstered massively, of course, by people fleeing the Sikh genocide and that dreadful large-scale massacre of Sikhs within India. We must ensure that the next generation of Sikh students in America don't spend time in classrooms wondering why their community is either entirely absent from textbooks and lesson plans, subsumed into another identity, in other words, they're branded as Indians or even Hindus, God forbid, or labelled as extremists or terrorists for seeking the right to self-determination. And of course, that is what India is doing. That is the agenda of India. That paragraph basically sums up, this is what Hindutva and the Brahmins of India are trying so hard to do, because they are doing their absolute utmost under sheer fear of the growing Khalistan movement. They need to push this agenda to try and relabel and redefine who Sikhs are, because they realise that the Sikh community community is actually winning the propaganda war. They are winning this information war, and that the Khalistan movement is growing in support and strength and momentum because of the fact that Sikhs are an independent community. They're an individual religion. It is an independent religion, and they absolutely have, therefore, under any concept of morality or even legality, they have the absolute right to their own sovereign territory. And that is what India is so afraid of. That is why they try and redefine who Sikhs are against the actual true narrative, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, this is the Hindutva, again, the extremists trying to erase the culture, the history, the language, the identity of Sikhs. And this is something that we see not just focusing on the Sikh community, but worldwide, where people are wanting to whitewash. They are wanting to erase and rewrite history, the events, the people, the impacts, and really to create different narratives about the history. And once that happens, we lose a very important tool of learning from the past so we don't repeat it. And that's where you have to have just the utmost level of respect for the Sikh community, because they are standing tall, they are standing proud, and they will not allow them to get away with just erasing their major influence and contributions to the world, Angus.
Indeed, absolutely. And of course, one of the key platforms that India has used to try and push this agenda is, of course, the media, whether it's online media or whether it's the mainstream media in India, or certainly trying to influence the media, the global media. Of course, we do know that so many powerful interests in India have, of course, their fingers in many pies, as we say. They do control a huge amount of very powerful media organisations, and it is those organisations that spread this misinformation. And misinformation really is the subject of my second story. And this is another article that came out last week. It's a fascinating article that appeared in The Caravan. The Caravan is always produces very interesting, in-depth and well-researched articles. And they produced last week another article which I wanted to bring out this week because it's a fascinating article. And it does highlight something that we do talk about on a regular basis, and it is obviously heavily linked into that story we just talked about. And they said that, for example, they brought out, well, they prefaced this article by saying, look, an article recently that came out that analysed Twitter. They found that over the previous year, the Indian government was among the top 4 countries sending legal requests to Twitter to take down content. And also one of the top countries seeking user data. So that, again, India's trying to find out who posted various tweets. Things are so out of hand now that the company has taken the Indian government to court for setting up an impermissible parallel mechanism that causes unrestrained censorship of information in India. So basically the accusation, which is backed up by facts, is that India is, again, trying to control the narrative. They hate the fact that anybody can use free press to criticise India or promote any interests that don't stand in India's interests. So again, it's very concerning. And of course, what this article will highlight, and I'll come on to this in a moment, is yes, of course, India and Hindutva has massive control of the Indian media. But of course, particularly domestically in India, it does have massive control over the law. Of course, the government forms the law. It controls how India operates as a society. And it's, as we often highlight and regularly highlight, India uses the law as a weapon. It has weaponized the law to attack its political enemies, and particularly to try and suppress the Khalistan movement, and particularly to target the Sikh community and of course other minority communities across India. And it's totally undemocratic. It flies in the face of the rule of law, and on any moral platform it fails massively. Now, this Caravan article, and I'm going to read parts of it through, it's a fascinating article, but it does highlight many examples of this. And it did recently, it says that the Tamil magazine, of course, regularly, we're talking a lot about Tamil Nadu as well, another area in India that has expressed interest in breaking away. And one of their magazines, the Ananda Vikatan digital version, Vikatan Plus, published a cartoon recently depicting Modi in handcuffs, sitting next to a laughing Donald Trump. 5 days later, Vikatan's employees suddenly found that the website was blocked, And it was blocked by a confidential order issued by this really quite scary ministry called the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. They have a huge amount of power. The magazine was not even made aware of this directive until the following day when it received the order. Now, the illustration referenced the mass deportation of Indians under the US president's anti-immigration crackdown. The official notice stated that the Victan website had been taken down on what it called emergency orders under Section 69A of the Information Technology Act. Yes, this dangerous act, this dangerous piece of legislation which is used and abused by the Indian government on a regular basis to take down anything that the Indian government doesn't like. In other words, anything that might criticise the Indian government. And it allows the government to remove online content on grounds such as what it calls the interests of sovereignty and integrity of India, defence of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states or public order, or for preventing incitement. In other words, it's a blanket definition that it could use for almost anything that it doesn't like to then legally take down. And the Tamil Nadu president of the BJP has filed a complaint to the MIB claiming that the news portal had published offensive and baseless content about Modi. So that's all it takes today in India to take down a piece of content that a notion of aggrieved sentiment is enough to remove any criticism of Narendra Modi and his government. And the same act was used recently against the BBC documentary India, the Modi Question. And again, we've mentioned this on a regular basis. And this was a BBC documentary which analysed how Modi handled those Gujarat riots in which I think, several thousand Muslims were killed in terrible riots back in 2002. And that is why Modi himself was ultimately labelled the butcher of Gujarat and was actually banned from travelling to the United States back in 2002. This is the Indian Prime Minister was banned from travelling to the United States because he presided over a massacre of Muslims back in 2002. And yet here is the man now in charge of India. And the BBC actually produced this documentary highlighting how Modi was involved in this. And of course, the same piece of legislation was used against the BBC to take it down. Or at least, in fact, the documentary was banned in India, but parts of it, as they tend to do, filtered out, leaked out onto social media. And of course, they were taken down wherever possible under the same legislation. Now, the Caravan 2 itself, this own website, received a notice to take down its investigation into the torture and murder of civilians by the Indian Army in Poonch, Jammu and Kashmir. Yes, how often again do we, James, talk about torture and indeed extrajudicial killings of Sikhs and Muslims that happen on an all too regular basis across northwest India? And any time that any publication like the Caravan, for example, tries to highlight the fact, those publications get taken down. I remember even a year ago doing a story about another news outlet in J&K that was closed down by the Indian government because it dared stand up and criticise the Indian government and their actions in J&K. It's happening on a regular basis. Now, when the Caravan, for example, tried to defend their stance on the criticism of the Indian government, they were just they weren't given any actual specific details of what they'd done wrong, just sweeping generalisations. No single factual inaccuracy in the article was pointed out by the Indian government. And that was it. It was as simple as that. Section 69A then, therefore, allows the government immediate censorship powers over individuals and platforms with no need for arbitration by the court, no substantive opportunity for anybody to be able to defend their case. In other words, it flies in the face of democracy. It's something that actually belongs in North Korea or Russia, not a democratic nation. Most people now understand that in mainstream media outlets, news is actively suppressed or spun in favour of the government. On television, our attention is continuously redirected and overwhelmed by frivolous issues. Indeed, how often, here even in the West, is that our attention is diverted into nonsense programmes. I can think of a few offhand immediately that are being publicly broadcast that fill our media, that are absolute frivolous nonsense. And they are usually rolled out to bury and hide actually serious political stories and oppression and governments running out of accountability. Any stories to do with that, people's minds instead are filled with nonsense to try and, well, in fact, in Roman times they called it, as long as we give them bread and circuses, people then don't care about how they're governed. And what we are fed, certainly in the West to some degree, but particularly in India, people are fed bread and circuses, as the Romans used to call it, to try and divert their attention away from what really matters, the fact that they are actually being oppressed and persecuted. And legacy English media has weakened its own standards while trying to avoid government scrutiny. So even the Caravan recognises it's happening here in the West. The government has been casting a wide regulatory net in India to also bring them under its surveillance and control. So James, I think this article basically just summarised what we have been saying for a very long time. We do know the fact that India has fallen down the rankings in the World Free Press Index. It sits in the bottom quartile of the world free press because India does not have a free press. And as I preface this discussion, India is doing its absolute level best to weaponize legislation like this dreadful act to ensure that any criticism of the Indian government is buried and removed immediately that it appears, and that the Indian government can go about its business persecuting its minorities completely unaccountable to any form of democratic norms, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And I think that it's time that there was some type of controls and regulations put in place for all media platforms, including social media, that they disclose how much is being invested by advertising revenues and subscription revenues by foreign governments and even domestic governments. I think that we need to see some transparency there, because how much is being manipulated by the algorithms? How much advantage are countries like India having on these platforms for the amount that they are investing behind the scenes and giving them that up over the other platforms? And when you look at, the need now more than ever for media outlets to stand up to these governments and these bullies and say, no, we're not going to settle these frivolous lawsuits to save money. We're not going to bow down and stop reporting on issues because you want us to. We really need to instill and protect the sanctity of media when it comes to their important role in democracy, Angus.
Absolutely right, indeed. So let's change subjects now, just as a quick one. And I mentioned in the introduction, I found when we were looking at Vaisakhi yesterday, I did overnight, I covered a great video, and I just want to show you this video. We talked about Vaisakhi, and quite often there will be huge displays of Gatka, this wonderful martial art with its roots all the way back to the wonderful military heritage of the Sikh community. And just take a look at this wonderful video.
There's two left. छोटे लगे सारे छोटे कितने हैं? Crack. Are you sure? हाँ जी महाराज. एक मिनट भाई.
Fantastic. That was in Southall in London over the Vaisakhi celebrations. That was a member of the Metropolitan Police, of course, a Sikh in his uniform, and a fabulous display, James.
Absolutely. I remember a couple of years ago when there was a display in Canada of that nature. And of course, the India propagandist idiots tried to make it seem like it was context that they were being violent in the streets. It was chaos. And it's like it was a demonstration for the crowd that they were showing, you idiots.
Yeah, talking about misinformation, a classic case. James.
Exactly. But
Right,
it's a
let's move on. Let's move on to our comments column as time is marching on. We need to rush through these. And for the comments today, I did a rare dip into our shorts. And of course, we do get a lot of comments on our shorts, which we do tend to neglect. So I did a quick dip into some of our shorts in the comments. And some of our regulars, of course, were very active in there. TC, and again, once again, we're back to the same old Sikhs are not Hindus. This offensive fallacy needs to be corrected. To be classified as a subgroup of Hindus amounts to the same thing. And there's a flagrant disregard to the principles of basic human rights, which includes religious freedom, self-determination. And again, James, it comes back to that whole my whole first story. Who speaks for the Sikh community? It's not the HAF or all these Hindutva organisations. Only the Sikh community can speak for Sikhs, and forever they're having to remind people Sikhs are not Hindus, James.
Absolutely. And just because Canada's in North America, don't call us Americans. It's kind of,
Yes, indeed. Yeah, very close to the bone. And the next comment from somebody who I'm afraid I cannot read your name, but it's there anyway. Sikhs are not Hindus nor Muslims. Sikhs are different from other religions, like the ocean floor to the last star of the galaxy. Again, very much the same. And Satpal Singh, again, along the same lines. I am a proud Sikh American. I would never label myself an Indian. I am Punjabi. Absolutely right. And again, our commenters, I mean, how frustrating for our audience. They have to come on to here to say, look, once again, we are sick and tired of being labelled as all these fake labels. We are not Indians. We are not Hindus. We are Sikhs and we are Punjabis. It's very frustrating. I feel your pain, as they say, James.
Exactly.
And now the next comment, again, I'm practicing my Punjabi, but this did translate as RSS terrorists are very worried about Khalistan. And I found particularly interesting about this comment, of course, yes, we often talk about how afraid the Brahmins and the Indian ruling elite are of Khalistan. They are terrified of this movement because it is growing so powerful. But the key word here is RSS terrorists. And you're absolutely right. I think it is, and we often talk about how Sikhs are labelled as terrorists, and this dreadful, irritating, regular reference to Sikh terrorism that even particularly in the US is having to be fought on a daily basis, the narrative. The real terrorists are in fact the RSS. They are this militant group who are pushing their militant agenda, and arguably it is the RSS agenda that is behind the transnational oppression, which in itself, almost by definition, is terrorism, James. So we all know who the true terrorists are here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've reported on this time and time again. And we always love that the audience supports us in our statements that way and that they share their opinions with us. So that's great.
Indeed, and Hardal Singh follows, again, the same thread. No way why. RSS is a militant group disguised as a Hindu group. And I think, yeah, I couldn't put it any better. That is exactly the problem. Now, Live Laugh Creation, you said in most videos, I think this is referring to me, looks like your focus isn't, your camera isn't focused, and it looks like you're looking to other sides. Okay, well, just to quickly explain, my camera, I'm not very massively technically minded. We don't have cameramen or camera ladies who operate our cameras. We are a very small outfit. Our cameras are fixed focus, so if I move backwards and forwards too rapidly, if I get too passionate, if I get too vocal and too excited, sometimes the camera can lose focus because I'm moving all over the place in my excitement to get my stories across. So apologies for that. And if it does look like I'm looking to other places, the reason is I have screens all over the studio with all sorts of information that I need to look at on a regular basis. Quite often when I'm reading the stories or when I'm talking about the stories that I talk about, my information is dotted on different screens. So if it looks like I'm not looking at you, my apologies. I am talking to you, but at the same time, I'm looking at something else to provide that information. So I do hope that explains to many in our audience who might wonder why I'm looking all over the place, or my camera is slightly out of focus, or James is looking a bit too red. It's because we're a very small outfit. We run small studios that we are trying to grow and build, but we're doing our best, James.
We are, and we are making improvements. We're working right now very hard to bring the production standards up much higher. So thanks for pointing that out. And by all means, let us know if you notice some substantial changes for the better or the worse so that we know that it's coming across. Because sometimes what we see on our screens isn't actually what ends up in the final cut or in the final edits and such. Sometimes the software changes things slightly as it gets uploaded. So just keep us informed.
Indeed, and just to let you know that here in London, our studio in London is undergoing a massive renovation. It's almost complete, so hopefully in the next, I don't know how long, but very soon you will see a massive change in the London studio, and we'll be filming, instead of having this backdrop, we'll have a completely different backdrop, and the whole studio will be completely changed with multiple cameras, etc., etc. In other words, the whole thing is moving up into a much more professional basis, so stay tuned for that. Right, and next set of comments, and where are we? Oh yes, Hap B says only a publicity stunt by the BJP because the Religious Freedom Report. Yes, this was this silly. Well, it's not silly. I mean, it was a charitable thing to do, but the BJP handed out these boxes to the Muslim population, containing all sorts of small, I'll say, life-saving articles, just a little bit of food and drink and what have you. But ultimately, it was basically, as we said at the time, a nice charitable act, but on the balance of scales of pros and cons, really, ultimately, it was just a cynical publicity stunt, as Hat B says. Again, because of the Religious Freedom Report, which actually condemned the BJP, condemned the Indian government for their dreadful actions against the minorities. And so this was almost a token effort, James, was it not? Just to try and appease some of the minorities, trying to pretend, look, we're not really that bad, despite all that we've done to you.
Yeah, and we're expecting to see more of it being in the press this week between Vaisakhi and Easter. Apparently, they are going to be heading out. The government's going to be heading out to give some more of these away to the minority communities or the lower press communities. So we'll watch and see how they spin it in the media.
Indeed. And the final comment of the show goes to Jazz Dosanjh, and the English part says, I'm in Canada for the last 30 years. Good job you're doing. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for your comment. And the bit in Punjabi I want to read is I find this very poignant. It says, it translates as, Sir, my father was also martyred with Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, of course referring to 1984 and that dreadful attack on the Harmandir Sahib Ji, in which Bhindranvale, Sant Jarnail Bhindranvale Ji was lost his life in the most heroic fashion, standing up for not just basic human rights, but particularly standing up for what the Sikh community represented. And in fact, if you indeed are related, if your father was martyred with Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, then wow, that's I would say that's an enormous legacy, and you should be enormously proud. I find that deeply sad. Of course, from a simply personal basis, a member of family. But ultimately, I think what those guys did, I think it was the most heroic stand. And I'd always refer people to the series that I did last year on the anniversary of 1984, where I looked in detail on an hour-by-hour basis of what Bhindranvale and these guys did on that day to defend the Sikh community and stand up for human rights. It just goes beyond heroic. These guys rightly are attributed as shaheeds, as martyrs, for what they did. They gave their lives for the most noble of causes in the most heroic way, and I think you should definitely be proud, obviously sad, but deeply proud of your father, James. I think that's a really, really great comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you summed it up perfectly there, Angus. And just my respect, my condolences. But at the same time, I may not be Sikh, but I am a human. And it's always sad to see the loss of life at such hands of violence and needlessness. So again, thank you to your father for being a human with compassion and ethics and standing his ground to protect others. So my respect.
Indeed. So thank you, Jazz Dosanjh, for that really powerful comment. But ultimately, that does bring Perspectives to close for another day. Please don't forget to keep those comments coming in. Thank you for loads of comments that have been pouring in after our show yesterday. Loads of great comments. So thank you for those. Don't forget you can message us directly at message@satlogetv.com, as many of you have done. Thank you for your emails that you sent with interesting links that we have, of course, taken a look at. Thank you to many of you who've done that. But if there is anything you'd like us to cover, do let us know. Send us a link or just send us a comment and we can follow up on that and bring them up on shows over following days. But that is it. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching Perspectives. It's a goodbye from me. It is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.